All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, the only thing that you rely on the US media to do at a time like this, when war is possible, is for them to parrot the official line from the State Department, especially if Democrats are in power. Now, millions of Americans are asking themselves at home right now, what the hell is going on in Ukraine? It's a complicated question. The White House and the media would have you all believe this just started yesterday, devoid of context, devoid of an understanding how we even arrived at such an insane place. I actually happen to love Russian history. It's a place that's fascinated me for a really long time. So let's take a trip down memory lane of US policy towards Russia. The Cold War, I'm gonna assume, is familiar enough to most of you. But after World War II, the world was basically left with two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The US, with its allied West, had one vision for the future of Europe. The Soviets had another. Both ultimately were about economic and security control as superpower conflict escalated. The US and the allied West seeking to show solidarity against the Soviets as they consolidated control over East Germany, and Berlin in 1947 signed a mutual defense pact with France and the UK. The next year, it included Belgium and some other Western countries, and in 1949, it was codified officially as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was specifically designed to extend the US nuclear umbrella over Western Europe to deter the Soviet Union. They responded in kind after the Soviets got the bomb with something called the Warsaw Pact in 1955, and it produced the famous Iron Curtain. It is critical to understand that NATO was specifically formed as a deterrent to the Soviet Union in the 1940s, because as the Soviet Union began to crumble, the United States sought a peaceful transition to a new world order. President George W. Bush and Secretary of State James Baker understood that Russia must feel secure to transition out of the Soviet Union, and should feel secure by intimating that they long feared NATO would not crawl east. President Bush specifically told Gorbachev that the US would, quote, not take advantage of the revolutions in Eastern Europe. And as East Germany began to fall and the country consolidated, there again was actually a pledge by the German side that NATO itself, while yes, was going to expand to East Germany during reunification, would not continue to go east. Secretary of State James Baker even told the Soviets that NATO would not expand, quote, not 1 inch eastward as the Soviet Empire collapsed. Now take those words very seriously, because they matter a lot in this story. While yes, the assurances were made in person, they were never made in writing, and it was never official US policy. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Bush administration specifically did not celebrate or declare victory so as not to antagonize or dance on the graves of the proud Russian people when they were down. It was a wise decision. It understood that how you handle victory is important, because if you squander it, you could find yourself in conflict again. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the US had a really big choice to make. What do we do with NATO? I mean, it doesn't really have a point anymore, or does it? And with the end of the Cold War came a new president, Bill Clinton, who had a lot of very idealistic views on international security. Clinton viewed the West and the NATO in its unipolar moment as the guarantor of peace across the world. And thus, when a civil war broke out in Yugoslavia, he committed not only the US, but NATO forces to an air campaign to try and protect civilians. This was a very pivotal moment because Yugoslavia, while always independent, has historically been the backyard of the Russian Empire, a place where they have been involved for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. And the interests of NATO didn't necessarily align with pro-Russian sentiment. It was the first sign to the Russians that NATO specifically had the ability to project military power in a place that they consider a vital security interest. From there, bigger decisions were made with NATO. Former Soviet states like the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland were admitted to NATO in 1999. Now, those states were begging for NATO membership because of their historic enslavement by the Russians. But it was then that the debate was never had. Why does any of this make any sense whatsoever? Sure, those states want to join. That's great. If I were them, I would do the same thing, and I don't blame them. But why do they deserve the nuclear guarantee of the United States to total war in 1999, when Russia was on its way to a corrupt oligarchic state facing a massive currency crisis and weak as hell? The hubris at the time of the US was, well, we can do whatever we want, and the Poles and the Czechs want to join, so okay, why not let them? We believed we could extend this guarantee with no costs. Now, this mindset continued under George W. Bush. In 2002, another major bridge was crossed. 7 new countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, were all invited to join NATO. Again, what's going on? Hold on a second. We are talking about a huge part of the traditional Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Why? What is the threat here? Keep in mind, in 2002, the U.S. foreign policy establishment thought that Putin could be a friend of the United States. Putin was the first leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11. He was invited to Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas in November of 2001. He was seen as a potential Democratic ally. But Bush and the United States effectively spit in his face months later with the expansion of NATO, and after the belligerent war in Iraq, the U.S. credibility on use of force was tarnished for all time. To top it all off in 2008, Ukraine and Georgia were officially invited to join NATO, leading to a Georgian conflict. That was a warning of what was to come today. Now, when I say we had no debate in this country over NATO, I really mean it. None. Zero. No panels. No congressional checks. Nothing. It was bipartisan policy. Only one man predicted what was to come: George Kennan. He was the famous father of our containment strategy against the Soviets. He wrote, quote, in 1996, this is a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion, to have an adverse effect on Russian democracy, and to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations. He was a brilliant man who was ignored in his time, and those warnings survives us to this day. So that brings us to where we are now. Putin's pretext and demand for massing troops near Ukraine is that he wants a guarantee from the U.S. that NATO will never expand to Ukraine. He sees the creeping NATO threat as a pretext to keep Russia down and weak forever, never able to retain their former glory. Is it kind of crazy? Yeah, certainly. But people with nukes get a vote in international diplomacy. And here in the West, we don't like to see the perspective of the other fella. And I put this all together because when you see the big picture, it's a lot more complicated. Putin is certainly the aggressor. If you look at events in just the last month, you zoom out a few decades, it's more complicated, right? I say none of this as a fan or an apologist for Russia. I think they are a belligerent, failing state. But when I look at this history specifically, what I see is the hubris of foreign policy elites in the United States. It has cost us enough. These people, they thought they could invade Iraq and expand NATO with no consequences whatsoever. So when you see our elites in the White House or on TV arguing over what should be done, remember, it's their fault we're even here in the first place. As younger Americans, let's come together and say, no, enough. Let's have the debate our leaders never had so that we do not repeat the age-old mistake of graying older men sending their sons abroad to die for their hubris and for their sins. And that's what I look at with that situation. I don't know how you can't look at that and say, well, we had a role in this.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.